I want to introduce our two last guests during this conference, Liva Vikmane, Vice President of ESU. You're also one of the Vice Chairs of the Bologna Working Group 3, working with policy development for new goals, looking into the future. And Cecilia Christersson, you are the Pro Vice-Chancellor of Malmö University. And you are also a chairperson in a special working group within the Association of Swedish Higher Education, focusing on refugee issues in specific. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Liva, you have been here during 2 days. You have been listening to a lot of discussions and comments. What are your reflections after these 2 days?
Yeah, can you hear me well? Yeah, you can. I will start first of like a broader outlook on the Bologna process and the social dimension, and maybe how we need to challenge it a bit. Because now I like also numbers. So according to the UNHCR, only about 1% of young refugees get access to tertiary education. And in comparison, it's around 34% of young people globally. So it's not only Europe, but globally. So the discrepancy is massive. And when we look at the Bologna process around 2000s, one of the areas that came into focus was the social dimension and access to education. So I want to put this discussion that we were having in the day, during the days, like today and yesterday, in a broader perspective of the social dimension access strategies that we're theoretically supposed to have in the Bologna process in Europe, in our countries, and how this discourse of refugees and asylum seekers should feed into it. Because now, up to now, we have been looking at social dimension access strategies as a part of, well, we have underrepresented groups that are students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, we have first-generation students and other minorities. But now maybe we should start question like our box of minorities. So what actually fits there? Because we have refugees in our communities. So first of all, I would like to link it with the content of the conference that we have been discussing from different perspectives, from the policy perspective, from the practice, what's happening on the ground. And this would be first that there should be synergies between the policy and the grounds, and the policy should be in a much more broader context, that you should look at access to education, and refugees, displaced persons and asylum seekers should be put there as one of those groups that we actually recognize within the communities. It's not like refugees that are somewhere there, but it's within our communities. And I have been seeing this context during the conference, so that's really good. Another note that I want to touch upon is especially these discrepancies between what's in the policy and what's happening, because Europe theoretically and hopefully in practice has an obligation to create conditions for refugees to access education. And I'm referring here for Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but I'm also referring to Geneva Convention 1951 on the status of refugees. So there is this very obligation, and when it comes to the practice, there is also one other obligation that is called Lisbon Recognition Convention that all of us have been referring to so many times. So there are concrete guidelines, and there is also political commitment that this has been set in place before. And then the question is, so where is the follow-up? And we have seen the follow-up in this room, so like yesterday and today, more into practice. And then the question is how to get those who are less active to actually implement these things, and how to get commitment, proper commitment from the governments and policymakers. So that's a bit of a reflection how it's on different levels and different commitments, including government or practitioners, and that there are different obstacles set in place. I can go also in obstacles that we need to tackle a bit more.
Yep, in a while, in a
okay.
bit. Yes. But Cecilia, what are your impressions?
Well, I gave you a cliffhanger yesterday, and I think I will address what universities are for, because exactly like Liva is saying here, we should address it in a broader perspective. To look upon higher education institutions as drivers for social change. I think that's one of our really big commitments that we need to take on, and we will have challenges there, of course. How do we increase access to higher education? Do we see that we need to have variety? Do we see that multicultural access really means also that we have to handle a lot of differences? And I don't think really higher education institutions are really up to par yet to open up for differences. And as long as we're not there, I think we're going to have a lot of problems here, and we need to have some helping forces to continue doing that. What I think also is important is the role of higher education. How good are we actually at giving our students good credibility of after their higher education to go out and being change makers in society and using what you actually learn in higher education besides your specific area of knowledge? That means to be a problem identifier, problem solver, using knowledge in a way that you can be critical about, also seeing what can you change and what can you not change. So I think we need to be pointing out that more. And I also think that if we talk about lifelong learning, to put higher education in a process of learning and seeing already from kindergarten till the day we die, we need to have transformation and transfer between different levels of education. And there comes the importance of actually having both trust and courage, I think, to give accreditation for all different levels of education that we actually see are making a progress for the individual. And the last thing I would like to say, I really, really agree everything you say about we have policy documents and we have everything. We just have to sort of structure, and I will give some sort of clues at the end here. But I think the most important thing was so encouraging to see in all the presentations, both yesterday and today, is that we always start from the individual. Because if we don't recognize the individual and actually decide that the individual is coming with competence, try to find out what the individual actually can show and add on the parts that we need to have in our different systems. I think that's a really good approach to use in whatever country we're going to work in.
And Liva, you were eager to identify obstacles, and now you have the chance.
Okay, so there have been identified obstacles over the last days, but I want to drive attention to some of the ones that NIC centers who deal with the qualifications and recognition have identified. And my colleague Blase already yesterday referred to the publication that we've done, and this is a further reference to it as well. So one of it is lack of information about education systems and qualifications, specifically in the countries of conflict. So it's more unknown at the moment. It's also questionable authenticity of the documents. So are they legit? Can they be approved? It's lack of documentation. Already it was mentioned before. It's incomplete qualifications, and it's also a number of applicants. And here we see, if we look at these obstacles, then there are different ways how to deal with them. And information provision is one of the most common ones. And it's, well, in the areas that are at the conflict at the moment, it's more problematic to set the structure there and get to know these areas and the procedures. But at the same time, when we look at the number of applicants and capacities, it's something that needs to have more resources from the state. It needs to have more common holistic approach from the policymakers as well. So how it can be tackled and how NIC centers can have a proper support. When we look at the recognition procedures at the institutional level, because our systems are not the same. Some of them are more centralized, some of them are more decentralized. So it's very important to recognize the autonomy of education institutions, but also to not set obstacles to exercise this autonomy. There was an example mentioned before from Malmö University in one of the sessions today that, well, performance-based funding is not favorable at the moment. No, recognition of credits is not favorable when you have performance-based funding. So these kind of obstacles, the systematic funding obstacles, should not become into place and restrict recognition procedures. And therefore you need to have like all stakeholders in a place to actually discuss it and agree what actually works here and how it can be supported from all sides. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Cecilia, out of all the challenges being stressed during these 2 days, what should we focus on?
I think what's so interesting with the French example that I thought about, I should probably have asked the question yesterday, and it's like you have, since very long time, a system in a country where different... Are the Swedish person here still? French? Yeah? Yes, great. Because I was really thinking about, we have to have this I would say, attitude change among the academia. So what happens if only a few higher education institutions take on this challenge? Will we have a divide of A and B teams, so to say, that some traditional elite institutions will not take this on? Or have you accomplished to make it through all higher education institutions in France? Because then I would like to ask you, how did you do that? Can we have a microphone there?
Do you want to answer? Yes,
yeah,
we have
she's
a microphone.
ready. I can see that.
You will get a microphone because you need to use the microphone. And if anyone else want to comment or ask questions to Liva or Cecilia, you're welcome to do that as well.
The process is very ancient. It began in 1934. And we had a person, which name is Vincent, who unfortunately died last year, who pushed the system at the higher level, at the ministry level. And we have laws, national laws, and each institution has to set validation. But as I told to some people, the only problem is this recognition of prior learning is generally inside lifelong learning department, which is, of course, in universities, but which works by itself. And this is why teachers are sometimes reluctant to these procedures, because they are a little bit outside. And validation, recognition of prior learning works well in engineers schools and university business schools, what we call in France IAE, and less in general courses, science or literacy. It's less.
What you mentioned yesterday too was that it was only 1%, but it is like over 4,000 people per year that goes through this recognition. And I'm really concerned that we need to take a follow-up so we can see what is the impact, because if you have all those amount of people actually getting into society and taking new roles, I think it would be interesting. What follow-up procedures do you have for these?
Yes, 1% of full validation, full diploma validation. It doesn't take into account the access, what we call validation law of 1985. This concerns a lot of students, but we consider in France this step is behind us, and we have to process to full or partial validation and combine the two procedures. And this with a shortened the path, and it permits to save money and save time for applicants and students. I don't know if I answer exactly
we will keep
your
on
question, but we can continue this
Thank
discussion further.
Because I think it's very important that we now do a follow-up of impact of all these validation processes that we do. I also think, as Liva mentioned here, that we do need funding. And I know that certain countries actually have access from companies that will actually go in and support validation processes. So I think there are different ways we can solve the funding and not having those designated that sort of cut off what the purpose is. But I think really those are the quite most important things. And I also think that leadership in higher education institutions has to go forward and say, this is something we do. This is actually something we do for obtaining good quality in higher education, for being prepared to meet challenges in society. We actually need to have much more inclusive approach for access to higher education.
Liva, summarizing this conference, what did we not mention? Are you missing something out? When we are talking about the refugee impact on recognition of prior learning and the Bologna process.
Maybe we skipped at some point collaboration with other authorities except from education background, like education bubble or education community itself, because there are so many like there are reception centers, there are municipalities, there are local governments that need to provide information, that do provide information for refugees at the point of their arrival. So that's quite a crucial point when they arrive. Do they have enough information and accessibility in their own languages to understand education system, because they're coming from very various backgrounds. So maybe that was not enough mentioned, but like we have been focusing on other things, obviously. So I would say that this should be emphasized also, and we need to learn how to communicate our education systems more at the very beginning, but also throughout the stay in the countries. But then, yeah, maybe we're going to touch upon Bologna process later, or
you can do it now.
Yeah. Well, I think we also didn't enough mention the political will to do it, because we have structures. We have Bologna process, we have different international cooperations, but at the end of the day, education is national competence and everything is happening on the ground on the national level. So, and if you will not have political will at the national level, then it will not appear magically from the international level somewhere. So it's also something that we need to consider, and we need to strongly call upon the governments actually to have it in the political agenda.
And they don't today?
Some of them do, some of them don't. Mm-hmm. To different extents, of course, but I think that we need to stand strongly and have more of it in their access strategies and in their funding models and in the approach to education, as you said also before, in a broader approach to education.
Mm-hmm. Cecilia?
What was the question?
Well,
what are we talking about?
If you had another hour for this conference, what would you fill that hour with?
I think actually, first of all, I think it was really good credit to the design of the conference. I actually would have liked to have more conversation from people actually being through different kinds of validation processes. I went home immediately after Fiona's reflection on our website about information. And it's painful to stand here and say we really have to work much better. And I also think what we should probably reinforce is that we need a probably new type of profession related to counseling. We're going to have a lot of migration coming in different types of settings. And I think we need to have people helping out processing on your different paths through education. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very excellent. I think that was also pointed out by both persons yesterday, how important it was to have a continuous contact at different levels. And we are so afraid in the higher institution that we are not following, that we are doing a little bit of mistake. I think we should be a little bit more brave and do some mistakes. We can actually learn from them too and saying, wow, that worked actually. So not always keeping to the exact protocol, but actually again working from individuals and learning from that.
Is there anything more from this conference besides Malmö University improving their website that we can bring into the Bologna process?
Absolutely. I think, again, I think the whole concept of Bologna process need to be not reinforced by new documents, but the way we work, how we collaborate. And I think this conference actually really clearly state that when we're sharing different experiences that we have done here, and I'm so impressed with everything is done in Europe, but how can we actually add that puzzle together and actually reinforce it even further. So we need to, I think, work in groups and collaborate more. And I think, again, going from good examples to implementations, which actually means that you're changing something you already have. One of the hardest things to do. So we need to be on board, all of us, and supporting. And I think it was so good examples here that we can start basically tomorrow to get going on this and helping out from the different countries and setting maybe a goal. That I think we should need. We should need a goal. It was also mentioned here, I think, yesterday. Where do we want to go? How far do we want to push this? And that always helps us to be a little more concrete.
And you're listening to Cecilia and Liva summarizing this conference. Are they missing something out? You want to add something to this summary? Raise your hand. This is your last chance. And Liva, while waiting for anyone to enter the floor, you are working with the Working Group 3, looking into the future, and you are supposed to develop new policies for the future. In that context, how can this conference contribute to your work in Working Group 3?
Yeah, first of all, I hope it will not contribute with the new documents and guidelines, because we have them and they are actually on spot, but they need to be implemented, and that's the future, how to look at it. From the Working Group 3 side, we have one of the topics is social dimension and the new learners. So while social dimension and access is already a strong focus of the Bologna process, we have taken an approach to look at the new learners in education and lifelong learning. So who they are, how to broaden access to education. So I actually believe that this content of the conference feeds into it perfectly, because recognition of prior learning is one of the flexibility measures, how to actually increase access, and especially for vulnerable groups like migrants as well. So it would perfectly come into this. And we are now discussing recommendations, and we'll see how we can take this further on and also incorporate it in the recommendations.
Mm-hmm. No? Then I ask you one last question. If you just want us to remember one thing out of this conference, what should we have in mind while leaving this conference? Cecilia.
To make change, you have to do it together, and it takes time. I think also we have to be good at identifying what activities actually bring forward the changes we want to see. And that's why, again, I think follow-up and implementation is really good. I would like to address something, though, which I was sort of key on here, yeah? Because I also think higher education institutions all over the world have to rethink where are we in 10 years? Because I think we will have students that will choose to go online and go on educational journeys, adding on their programs, not as strict as we have been doing since hundreds of years back. So I think we have to be prepared to see how we deal with accreditation between different settings of education and how it's delivered. And again, I think the trust of saying that another institution can actually do this maybe a little better than we. I mean, at least we have to give cred and actually, again, testing. And I think I'd rather do a testing where 9 comes out of 10 very good and maybe something different than sort of being afraid of the one that's sort of sneaking under the line. But I really think that we have to look upon another scenery of higher education. And that would maybe solve some of the problems. I don't want to go into that further, but I think it will.
Okay. And Liva, if we should have one thing in mind leaving this conference, one thing to remember from this conference, what would that be?
First, like I will mention 2 things. First is the purpose of education, like the broader spectrum, why we're here and why education is there for the society and why we need to grant equal access to everybody. And then the second thing is that this has been like kind of a peer learning activity as well, as we have heard many examples, and to not be afraid to call up your colleagues and elsewhere and ask, hey,